Protesting against injustice can be emotionally fulfilling, but it isn't always politically successful. In her new book Changemaker, Lisa Mueller draws on lessons learned from social science to show how to make activism effective. In today's episode, Lisa and I discuss balancing the impulse to act with the need to think strategically, why broad coalitions need focused messages, and how important non-violence is. As we're a few weeks away from the US election, and polls are still worryingly tight, we touch on what people should be thinking about now ahead of a potential Trump win. I also introduced Lisa to the comedy stylings of Dylan Moran, and for a second episode in a row, I managed to work in my love for The Real Housewives of New York. This is one of my favourite conversations so far, so I hope you enjoy it. Lisa, thank you again for being a guest on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start with my James Lipton questionnaire. What is your favourite word?
My favorite word is curiosity.
Nice. What is your least favourite word?
Distraction.
What is your favourite curse word?
Fuck? Is that too obvious? Used one.
Are there any notable times during a protest where you've used it?
Of course.
What sound or noise do you love?
Sound or noise? Lately I've been playing a lot of Chopin. So
Nice.
I love the sound of Chopin polonaises.
Nice.
If that's not too highbrow.
Not at all. What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Crying babies on an airplane.
Yes. What is your favorite book?
Oh, I can't choose just one. I know that's a cop-out answer, but I, at the risk of sounding like a total snob, I read a lot, and I read very omnivorously with no particular focus, so it kind of depends on the month. Right now I'm reading the new Malcolm Gladwell, but, in another month I might be reading Dostoevsky, so... It just kind of runs the gamut. Depends on my mood and what kind of self-therapy I'm doing to myself.
I mean, recently I've been reading too many non-fiction books, and I feel like I need some fiction to balance it out.
Yeah, I hear that.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you imagine yourself to be?
I don't know if this is too much of a deep cut for your audience that probably is older than 10 years old, but there's an animated film called Turning Red. And it's about a little girl growing up in Toronto, and when she gets angry, she turns into a panda. And she's this bespectacled Cantonese girl, and I just identify a lot with her and her quirks and her kind of family situation, so yeah.
So you open Changemaker with a story about an act of protest that your great-grandmother made in China in the early 1900s. Sort of unbinding your great-grandmother's feet. And I was curious reading it if that sort of influenced you to sort of work on protest and activism in your sort of studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it influences many things I do. Just, it inspires me to approach everything with ambition and to take advantage of the freedoms and opportunities that wouldn't have been possible without that first... fateful gesture. I have a tattoo on my upper arm here that says Unbound, and it's in the font, Cheltenham font, that the US Congress has traditionally used to publish legislation. And there is a specific bill on the Senate records that allowed my family to remain in the United States above an anti-Chinese immigration quota. And that included my great-grandma, whose feet were unbound. And so she really, forgive the metaphor, ran with the freedom that her mother gave her all the way to the United States. And, as they say, the rest is history. So yes, like in the act of protest, I think of that. But also, when I go to work and I'm teaching my students and just trying to do my best and live my dream and, live my best feminist life, I could say, I really feel like I'm walking in her footsteps. It's too easy to make metaphors about this. Like I have big shoes to fill and all that stuff. But as cheesy as it sounds, I also really mean that sincerely.
Something else you talk about in the book is sort of the tension between the impulse to protest against an injustice and taking time to consider how best to do it strategically. And in the book, you're talking about your students, but I was wondering if you went on a similar journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Early in the book, I tell an anecdote from a protest I attended here in the Twin Cities where I live. It was a political protest. I don't know the political persuasion of your audience, and so I don't want to alienate anyone by getting.
There'll be progressives. There'll be progressives.
Okay, so it was an anti-Trump rally. I went to an anti-Trump rally and you used my favorite curse word a lot all night, and I was hoarse and I was like waving a sign, and I actually ran into a student at that protest late into the night, right before the crowd went to go and occupy a freeway, and my student said, "Professor Mueller, are you here to study us?" Which I understood as a sincere question because he knew me as a scholar of protest. But on that night, I was a protester like him, marching shoulder to shoulder in righteous indignation. I got home that night and, was fired up, like even euphoric from the solidarity that I felt. I felt somewhat soothed by having shared in a collective anger with like-minded people. I felt like I had affirmed some kind of political identity. But that euphoria wore off. I kind of had like a protest hangover the next morning that lingered longer than normal hangovers, in fact. And over the next few weeks, I kept asking myself, like, what did we accomplish, if anything? And I thought, well, maybe I am in a unique position to try and figure that out. And so to look myself in the mirror and ask myself what I was accomplishing through my activism besides feeling fired up for one night. And then also to ask, like, how can we activists channel our good intentions the most effectively? And I drew a lot of inspiration from advances in the development economics field. So in 2019, 3 economists shared the Nobel Prize for applying randomized controlled trials that have long been used to test the effectiveness and safety of medical treatments, like our COVID vaccines, to anti-poverty campaigns. And I realized that protest can sometimes be a matter of life and death, or at least a matter of really improving people's lives or allowing injustices to persist. And so I thought, well, why not take a similar approach as the development economists and take these piles of really sophisticated findings from social science on what tends to work better than other protest tactics, and then like put it in the hands of activists on the ground who can actually put that knowledge to work.
A point you made that really surprised me was that for how iconic the Women's March is, it didn't actually lead to any kind of substantive policy changes. And that quite surprised me in terms of just the, I don't sound very cheesy, but I love The Real Housewives of New York. And there's a particular episode where Dorinda and Carol Radziwill go on the Women's March, and most of the episode is built around them going on the Women's March. So I was just surprised for all the sort of iconography of that march that actually it didn't actually have any impact. And actually it's right-wing activists seem better at focusing on what they want and using protest to get it.
Right. So, like, first I want to offer the caveat that we don't know the full extent of the effects of the Women's March of 2017 that happened right after Trump was inaugurated. There might be some even intangible effects that social scientists have not observed. But you're right, in terms of obtaining concrete concessions in line with protesters' demands, the women's marchers came up largely empty-handed. And if we consider what happened several years later with the reversal of Roe versus Wade that had for decades protected access to abortion, the Women's March collectively faced an enormous and historic setback. In contrast, as you say, to the anti-choice movement that has marched annually on the US Capitol called the March for Life, that won their marquee concession of rolling back abortion rights. And I'm probably one of the few people who has attended both of those protests, right? Like usually those demographics do not overlap. But for research purposes, I did, in just like close succession, attend the Women's March and the March for Life, and there was no mistaking the difference in the cohesion of the messages. There are many factors that can influence the success or failure of a protest in terms of winning what the protesters demand, and that's why the book has more than one chapter. But one really salient difference between those protests was how cohesive or united the demands were. So when I was at the Women's March, I'd look left and there would be a sign calling for abortion rights to be protected. And I'd look to the right, but there would be a sign to like protect the environment. And then, I'd look behind me and there was a sign to protect trans folks. It was kind of this hodgepodge of progressive goals. Whereas if you were to like beam down from outer space into the March for Life, there would be no mistaking the singular goal of the throngs in attendance. They wanted to reverse Roe versus Wade. That seemed to have paid off.
I feel like the right are much more better sequencing what they want. So for example, right now the after succeeding on abortion, the shift is now going to say IVF. So it's much more of a cynical salami slicing, whereas something that frustrates me about progressives in the left is that usually it's everything all at once, and then the effect just gets kind of lost.
Yeah, so that everything all at once feature of a lot of left activism can be at once an advantage and a disadvantage. So it's a disadvantage insofar as it like creates this cacophony of jumbled demands. But on the other hand, I write in the book about how advantageous it can be to have a diverse coalition. And that's because you want to show to power holders that your movement is not just a radical fringe, right, of like the usual suspects, like the most left feminists, for example. Like, oh, we actually have a broader cross-section of people on our side. And especially in an electoral democracy, people in power, elected people, have it in their best interest to pay attention to a diverse coalition because it's those people's votes who matter, not just a tiny fringe. But that imperative to have a diverse coalition often competes with the imperative to have a unified message. Right? It's this kind of delicate ballet. And so what I recommend in the book is that you maintain that diversity, or what the left will sometimes term intersectionality, but then you do some really mindful coordinating work, right? And you use the word sequencing. And this is exactly what I recommend, that you can have a diverse coalition with 6 different progressive goals. But hey, at this protest, this Saturday, let's highlight goal number 1, right? And so we're going to pass out signs, and all the signs are going to be about reproductive rights. And then next week, we're going to have another protest, and our coalition members will show up in droves. But the theme of the day will be something different. It'll be like capping carbon emissions, right? So that any power holder listening and watching on that day will not face this like cognitive tax of trying to sort through all of your hodgepodge of demands. They will have a clear agenda of how to respond to what you want.
I mean, 2016 was a terrible year for Britain as well. We left the EU. And after that, there was a very strong backlash to Britain voting to leave. People who wanted to remain in Europe felt that the referendum that we had was kind of close. It was 52-48. So the feeling was like, should we do such a big step over such a small margin, etc., etc., etc. And I was very much caught up in that. I was very much wanted to stay in the EU. And then sort of as the years went by and the negotiation was going on, I felt a similar sort of thing with pro-European activists here, which is there was a lot of self-indulgence, like the sort of feel-good factor of demanding this. But then what actually people wanted out of this was so very diverse, because some people said we should have a second referendum. Other people were saying, no, we should have what was called a soft exit, which is not in the EU, but part of its customs union. And so there was all this hodgepodge of things, and then in the end there was no real cohesive political reason for politicians to listen to stay in the EU, and then sort of we left.
Yeah, I think that's another good example. I mean, something that I write about to explain why these hodgepodge style demands tend to fall short is, there's a cognitive mechanism at play here. So in order for someone to agree with you, to be persuaded by you, to give you what you want, they need in the first place to understand what the heck it is that you're demanding, right? So I'm kind of like coming back to square one, like at the neurological level, how can protesters make their demands work better? And we as activists often skip that step for understandable reasons, right? Like I think you're totally normal if you jump into a protest in the face of some really egregious injustice without first reading a pile of scientific papers. Like, I understand that, right? But it turns out that some of the science, including some of the cognitive science, can become a tool for social change, right? That if we understand like how the brain works, right, as like wonky and removed as that might seem with respect to fighting in the trenches, in the streets, then maybe in the long run, our labors in the streets will pay off better. And so to spare activists the hassle of having to read arcane scientific papers about like brains, I translate that work in the book. It's just a matter of, I think, diplomacy to kind of I guess convince activists who often have a comparative advantage in passion, right? That kind of these more like these drier calculations can complement the good intentions. And it's kind of a hard sell, to be honest. And like there is a historic gap between scientists and activists that I'm trying to bridge.
I mean, something I really did like about Changemaker is part of my background is in sort of electoral politics and campaigns and stuff like that. So what I did really like was a lot of what you recommend was sort of, it came naturally to me being involved in sort of the electoral side, but not necessarily taking it across to the protest and activism side. So like building partners, like the strategic historian Lawrence Friedman says the most advantageous move you can make is allying with someone, because you boost your relative power. Not only doing that, but then having specific goals, having talking points, issuing the talking points, treating it like a sort of proper campaign with specific goals. And so I find that really interesting, because my frustration often is that the impulse runs ahead and then it just all dissipates.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you're correct to draw parallels with the electoral politics space where, evidence-based strategies have become standard fare. Now campaigns, at least those with the resources, are hiring armies of polling analysts and forecasters, and we have like Nate Silver style like money-balling of elections and all of that. And of course in like Moneyball itself, right, like in baseball, I don't know if that's like too American of a reference, but in sports, right, like managers are trying to like crunch the numbers to maximize the win rates, just like campaign managers try to do the same. And so what I'm proposing in this book in the activist space is a lot of really battle tested advice, right? Like I am not innovating the concept of bringing hard evidence to bear on like any realm of human endeavor. It's just that the evidence revolution, as it's called, right? Like the kind of rise of like empirical science for social change, for some reason has not yet taken root in actual revolutions. I say for some reason, but I think I have a theory as to why that is. And that's because unlike other realms of human endeavor, like sports and elections and finance and medicine, activists are embedded in cultures, in communities that prize not just victory, but also authenticity, right? Like what it means to be an authentic activist is not just like optimizing your output, right? It's also affirming your authentic membership in your community. And sometimes those two goals conflict. But I do think that there is a cost when we kind of put our like communal feelings ahead of the prize because like I said before, the stakes of social movements and protests can be enormously high. Like when we're fighting for things like the survival of our very planet, right? Like the planet doesn't care how good we feel about our community membership, right? That solidarity matters. I don't want to trivialize it. Like that can be a tremendous moral resource, but winning social movements need more than moral resources. They also need winning strategies.
A few weeks ago, my guest was Armel Khan, and he's an expert on disinformation. And he said that the real danger from online manipulation isn't in the weeks and months leading up to an election. It's sort of the years-long work of changing the public debate on issues like race and immigration and gender. Something I often worry about is that, and you kind of alluded to this in the book, that the hard right and sort of reactionary elements are much more cynical and calculating in doing stuff than, say, sort of the left are. That the left will also act on impulse, whereas conservatives and sort of reactionaries will sort of sit back a bit and think and judge. And I'm sort of curious, what is your view on... So something that really frustrated me was when Black Lives Matter started, and this thing started of post a black square under the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and lots of people were doing that, sort of posting black square, black square, black square, until someone pointed out that this was a far-right tactic to essentially suppress any imagery of protests, because as soon as you go on the hashtag, you'd just be met with a wall of black, and you wouldn't actually see anything that was going on. So another strategic question I struggle with is sort of how do you be more... How do you temper that impulse to react to, say, stuff online, deliberately provocative stuff online, and not fall into like these traps?
Oh, well, you know, that's a tough one when you are operating in an online space where something like the black box can become viral so quickly, right? And that virality can really short circuit any efforts to kind of pause and strategize. And so I guess like my advice would be more for current or would be movement organizers, right? That when you see that kind of thing happening, if you identify it as a potential setback for the movement, then you can be a coordinating mechanism, right? Black Lives Matter is it's well known for being quite horizontally organized. And I would not classify it as purely leaderless. There are people who at different times have taken leadership roles at, in local actions, and of course in launching the movement with the hashtag. But there are other moments when I think there could be even there could be more, if not leadership, coordination. So leader is kind of a weighted word in some progressive activist spaces because it implies a hierarchy. And so I just want to clarify that I'm not advocating for like a heavy-handed kind of top-down hierarchical situation here. It's more just like someone can come out and say, hey, people are all posting this black square. Here are some potential like downstream setbacks that might befall us. Here's an alternative, right? And so sometimes it just takes kind of shaking people out of an equilibrium in that way, like giving people like a new mental repertoire for an alternative. And that coordinating voice can come from below as well as from above. But usually people they just default, right? And it doesn't occur to us to kind of disrupt.
I mean, I have seen sort of, it seems to be the rise of the Instagram information card, and someone, whoever, just on their own, initiative will break down an issue or key facts, and you will just see it spread completely as a way to sort of cohere things.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think that there tends to be a very binary view toward platforms like Instagram and X, where you're either like a techno pessimist or a techno optimist, right? Like it's like, oh well, we're gonna have the situation like right wing like counter protesters like using the black box tactic to undermine left movements, or people are saying, oh well, like look, here's this application of Instagram, like where we can have these like succinct explainers to like really rally activists around a cause. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, right?
Mm.
And so I come out as neither a techno optimist nor a techno pessimist, but more as someone who says, hey, like as activists, let's think about how we can use internet technology the most effectively. Based on the science that I review, some of those most effective technological approaches are not entirely intuitive. So for example, some techno-pessimists would say, oh, well, hashtag activism, which they might deride as slacktivism, posting hashtag Black Lives Matter, posting, hashtag Me Too, is bad for movements because that's going to like lull people into a false sense of security, and it's going to like convince them that they're doing enough and prevent them from taking more meaningful action. But actually, we have really compelling social science suggesting that slacktivism can help rather than hurt a movement. And like one reason is by drawing in new activists whose alternative is not being like more radical hardcore activists, but being not activist at all, right? And so like kind of like a virus needing fresh blood to spread, so does a social movement need fresh blood to spread. You cannot grow a social movement to like enormous size by relying only on the like ultra hardcore, full-time card carrying members, right? So that's one reason why slacktivism can actually be beneficial. And another is because it creates common knowledge around a view. If even your apathetic friend is suddenly posting hashtag, Black Lives Matter, then you lose plausible deniability, right? Like you can't say, oh, I didn't know any better, right? Like everyone knows it, even like beyond the hardcore activists. And so to go back to my point, like, I think that it's key if you're trying to be a savvy activist, it's key to avoid like these knee-jerk reactions to things like hashtags, and to ask the empirical question, the scientific question. On average, does this thing, like posting a hashtag, help or hurt movements? And we do have scientific answers, and now they're, I hope, more accessible in my book.
Well, I mean, that kind of reminds me of years and years ago, I read a blog post that just kind of stayed in my mind. It's by a guy called Adam Elkus. I think it's disappeared now. And he is a sort of national security sort of writer. And basically the article was about how people find it easier to argue over tools than the purpose for which the tools are being used. So his example was, and this was written in sort of 2012, drones. So drones don't open up any new moral dilemma that didn't already exist with, say, planes or missiles. Yeah, everyone was arguing a lot about should drones be used versus should they not be used, and not about the actual policies for which those tools are being used. So should the United States remain in Afghanistan? Should it be a counterterrorism strategy or counterterrorism strategy? All those issues were too hard. It was just easier to argue about should we use drones or not, because the tool is easier to comprehend than the policy. So I guess it's sort of similar of like, it's easier to argue should we use Instagram or not use Instagram, or X or not, because it's more difficult to argue the purpose for which they should be used.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, or in short, like nuance is hard, right? It's really hard to see nuance in things. And like our brains are not wired to think in nuanced and scientific terms, right? And like for good reason. Like we have evolved various cognitive biases right? Like, to simplify our world, to expend the least cognitive power to understand our world. Like, it's a lot simpler to say, oh, Instagram good, Instagram bad, than it is to say, under what conditions is Instagram useful on average for this specific outcome, right? Like, that's the way a scientist thinks, which is like very unnatural because, in the Paleolithic times, if you were like roaming around and just trying to survive, like, and you heard a tree rustle, if you thought, is that a lion that's about to come and demolish me? Is it? But maybe I'm drawing a false inference. And how can I test this hypothesis against the existing data? Like, it would be too late, right? If it was in fact a predator. And our brains don't care about like helping us discern these nuances. They just care about like making us survive to pass on our genes, right? And so I don't blame anyone who kind of, simplifies these debates about like which social media platforms benefit or set back social movements. There's nothing wrong with you if that's the way you think. But one thing that makes us human, right? One thing that distinguishes us from other critters in the world is that we can choose to see nuance, right? Like, if we are not currently like on the savannah trying to dodge predators, and sometimes we are, right? And this is why in crisis moments, which describe many protest settings, we find it more difficult to see nuance, right? Why our arguments become blunter and nastier. That's why, like, again, I wrote this book so that like when you're in the next crisis and you're protesting about it, you don't have to like force your brain to do this unnatural gymnastics to like find the nuance. You can be like, oh, what does like the chapter say on violent and non-violent tactics? Like, should I throw this rock right now? Yeah, so I'm just trying to kind of like take this more nuanced science and then like make it mind friendlier, if that makes sense.
Have you heard of the Irish comedian Dylan Moran?
No.
So he does a great bit about how long it would take English people to rise up over an injustice. And he sort of says, there'll be about 10,000 years of like rattling our newspapers, just going like, I mean, really? And then sort of another 40,000 years of like putting our teacup down heavily and going, and just like, outrageous. And I would say I'm guilty of that. I've been sort of slow to appreciate the value of protest and activism. Like, in my case, I think it's partly a sense of shyness or a self-conscious feeling of being sort of out there or sort of making a spectacle of myself. Something you talk about in Changemaker is how actually someone like me isn't necessarily alone. That there are a lot of people who, even if they agree with an issue, are reluctant to participate in a protest. So I'm sort of curious about how would you go about encouraging people like me to actually come out and support the issue that I agree with. I'm just a bit shy.
Yeah, well, one thing that impedes potential activists from taking the plunge is uncertainty about whether their efforts will pay off. And I count myself among those folks. Like, I have protested from time to time, but I would have protested a lot more had I been more confident that my actions were going to actually move the needle on the issues I was trying to support. And so, like, my broad answer is, just like learning the material in this book, right? Like, learning what tactics tend to work better than others. And again, this is on average, so there are no guarantees. Just like there's no guarantee that a medicine's going to cure you, but like on average, some medicines are more proven than others, right? That can instill you with the confidence to like walk out into a protest the next time if you evaluate that protest and you think that it's doing things right. Yeah. Just like you might be more inclined to take like, a clinically tested vaccine than a vaccine that your friend concocted in their garage, right?
Or bleach.
What was that?
Or bleach.
Right, or yeah, you wouldn't drink bleach. Well, I mean, depending on your political proclivities, I guess. But yeah, and so that's like my first answer is just giving your brain the opportunity to trust your actions, right? And like this is the same mechanism behind why we do or do not procrastinate on like much more trivial things. Or like if you decide that you want to become a great novelist, right? But you really have no idea what it takes to become a great novelist. Like you have, you haven't studied literature in school, you haven't talked to any successful novelists. Like you're just like, oh, I'm going to do like, National Novel Writing Month or something and just like kind of start like, you know, puking words on a page. Your brain does not trust your process. And so about 3 days into this like writing streak, you're going to give up, right? Because your brain is like, whoa, pump the brakes. Like this is not a promising approach. And our brains, again, they've evolved like very kind of like on a just very basic level. Like the same kind of operating system is going to like manifest like whether we're trying to write a novel or whether we're trying to like save the planet from the climate apocalypse, right? Like if our approach to saving the planet from climate apocalypse is like, let me just go out in the street and like shout the first thing that comes to my mind with a bunch of other people who are doing the same, and like we're all just winging it, we're all angry, but we only have like the vaguest sense of like what we're doing, your brain's going to kind of give up on that, and it might even give up before you get out the door, right? And so that would be my advice to hesitant activists, is to like figure out what kind of activism is most likely to work, and then you'll be more inspired to do that.
I think your point about offering fun kind of reminded me of the vibe shift that happened when Harrison Walls started talking about joy in terms of the campaign, in contrast to the weird, very serious right.
Yeah, that's right. So if you are already like on board with activism, right? Let's say you are organizing a protest, you're organizing a movement, and you're trying to recruit others to join, then yeah, you want to use some of the tactics that I list in the chapter on collective action mobilization, which includes like making your event fun for people, right? And so there's actually quite a stark split, left-right split on this front. So progressive protests tend to be like livelier and more joyful and more fun than right-wing protests, which are, a lot of fear-mongering and like angry speeches and, fewer like drag concerts, right? But people, we know from economics that oftentimes in order to join a collective action, people need selective incentives, meaning some goodie that you only get if you do the thing, right? You can't free ride on other people. So like if the activists win a higher minimum wage, then you can enjoy that whether you showed up or not. But if the protest is like a free concert, you can only enjoy that if you go to it. And so a savvy organizer would offer those kinds of selective incentives to boost participation.
That Dylan Moran joke made me think of something that Jamel Bowie, the New York Times columnist, made a point recently that a lot of essentially white American voters don't believe that anything bad can ever happen to them. So, there's no reason for them to be worried about Trump's authoritarian rhetoric because, this is America. Like, nothing really bad happens. So there's no real reason to worry. So I'm curious about how would you try and get those people engaged in activism?
People who think they're invincible?
Well, or just like for however, say, dark Trump would get in his rhetoric or Vance would get in his rhetoric, fundamentally, nothing really changes for them economically, socially, and they think it won't change for the country either. But it's just nothing ever bad happens to America, so there's no reason to worry. It's like how would you try and engage those people to engage in activism?
Well, I guess like I don't know, to be totally honest, personally, I probably wouldn't want to engage those people in activism because they sound like they might have some nefarious goals. But I mean, on the matter of change or your belief in its possibility, I mean, at a very basic level, you must believe that some kind of change, either negative or positive, is possible before you engage in protest, right? Like otherwise, like what are you trying to promote or forestall? Um,
I mean,
and yeah.
I was sort of thinking of God forbid, sort of Trump wins, and there is a move towards hollowing out elections, um, and basically there would be, say, voters now who would be sort of like, that would never happen. Like, this is America, so not that sort of thing wouldn't happen. That's the kind of thing that happens elsewhere in the world. It's not kind of what happens here. And so what I've been sort of struggling with is, how do you convince those people that in order to that their freedoms are under threat, and therefore they need to engage in activism to make sure that they are protected, is what I was kind of.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, so I think like a situation like that might need to take a page out of the book of like late 20th century feminists who engaged in a lot of consciousness raising, right? Um, and so what you're calling for here is really like, an eye, like to open one's eyes to the real stakes, right? And without kind of allowing the catastrophe to play out, right, and realizing only too late what is at stake, you would need to have someone like credibly convey that potential to that group. The trouble is the credible part, right? When you have people in their own ranks like denying this possibility, it's difficult. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty cynical like on that front. I'm not gonna lie, and I also realize that it's extremely unlikely for people on the hardcore right to ever take a page out of the feminist books of the late
Well,
20th.
I didn't mean sort of the right. I meant sort of just ordinary white American voters in sort of the Midwest or in swing states who sort of are, say, the quote unquote undersided voters who are just sort of the underlying belief is that basically everything is fine for them, and therefore everything is fine for America. So the idea of Trump being a dictator isn't a serious possibility, because there aren't dictators in America, because nothing ever bad happens in America. So I'm sort of curious about engaging those people who are just uh, outside of really engaging in politics, who would never really come out on a protest, and sort of trying to engage them.
Yeah, so I want to be very real about the low likelihood of ever engaging them, right? I mean, there's a reason why activism is historically a, a tool of the weak, right? Like it's the last resort when you don't have access to the halls of power, right? When you do not have economic leverage, when you do not have the security of being in a dominant racial group, when you are not able to like viably run for office yourself or have elected members of government listen to your voice. It's a really big ask to take like the most privileged members of society and like say, hey, like march with us in the streets, right? And so that's why like in political science on coalition politics, we write theories about, you know, different coalition configurations, like who might join based on like ideological proximity and like the size of their constituents. But we seldom write a theory that would predict that like the Green Party would form a coalition with like fascists, right? Like those are just so, they're like they occupy such different worlds that it's almost like out of the realm of possibility. And I don't want to call anything totally impossible, but I think like having a coalition for progressive change that includes people who have no perceivable grievances at all, right? And like no sympathy with the grievances of others. Like I just don't see that happening. I don't think that's necessary though. Like you do not have to have 100% buy-in to have a really powerful coalition.
Something that concerns me a lot about debate over America's future is a sort of an implicit acceptance of, say, violence. Like there's a lot of rhetoric about sort of civil war. There was that film over the summer about like a second American Civil War. And yet what I found really interesting in Changemaker is you stressing how effective and strategic nonviolent protest is.
That's right. That's one of the most robust findings in the whole social movements literature, that violent tactics almost always backfire on protesters. The good news is that despite, these scary narratives that, you've been hearing, that I hear as well, about like a new civil war, or like all of this impending violence. And of course there are horrible isolated instances of violence. The vast majority of people, like in representative polls, reject violence. My own research subjects, like when I survey them, they write in all caps about how much they abhor violent protests. Like, so there's some good news there, like that the average person already intuitively rejects violent protest. But I guess I wrote the chapter on the effectiveness of nonviolent protest mainly just to like validate that inclination. Because when there are rare moments of violence, like there was some looting during Black Lives Matter protests, even though 99% of BLM protests were peaceful, um, this kind of, it can draw a lot of attention to the violent incidents and then like set back the movement, right? And so I just kind of want to remind people that even a small dose of violence can create a huge PR problem for a social movement.
I really like the point you make about how essentially certain media outlets are just looking for these things that to then discredit the wider movement.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And the negative press falls disproportionately on violent protesters and even nonviolent protesters from marginalized groups. And so we have like experiments showing that white onlookers perceive protesters of color to be more violent than they actually are. And so the chapter on violence and nonviolence is not just there to say, hey, don't be violent, because as I said, most people are disinclined to be violent anyway, but it's to say, hey, remind people how nonviolent you are, right? So that the media are not falsely portraying you as violent troublemakers. Another side of violence in protest is violent repression. So sometimes protesters are not instigating violence, but rather on the receiving end of it. And interestingly, some research by my colleague Omar Wasow suggests that when protesters are experiencing violent repression, this can actually help the movement. So, of course, we never want protesters to be violently repressed, but if they are, it can really advantage them to call that out, right? And to say, like, not only are we civilly resisting, right, but we are also suffering violence at the hand of these counter protesters or of the state. And we do have empirical evidence suggesting that that can raise public sympathy with the movement.
I mean, with the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014, one of the key events that turned it from a youthful protest into a sort of widespread revolution was the security forces shooting at the protesters, and then that brought out the parents of the teenagers and students who were out on the streets, and then it was that act of violence that catalyzed it into this more widespread revolution.
Yes, that's a fantastic example of what I'm describing.
So when this interview goes out, there'll be about 20 days until the US election. Are there things people should be thinking about now ahead of November if the worst happens ahead of 20th of January?
If the worst happens. Well, I would say think about what you want to get out of any protest that you're doing, right? I also want to say, like, there is room for just catharsis, right? Like, going back to my very early example of like attending an anti-Trump rally, I didn't expect our efforts to reverse the election. I don't know, I just wanted to yell into the void, I guess, right? And so that can be okay, right? Like, we are humans and we need outlets for our rage, right? But I would say also, let's ask ourselves, can we win something more? Sometimes the answer might be no, right? Like, if a democratic system is operating as it's designed, and unless you want to go out and like stage a full revolution to like overhaul that system, which some people do, and we could talk about that, but we might need another hour, right? You want to think, well, is there something concrete that we want to win, right? Like, if, hey, Trump just won, and the circumstances matter, right? Like, did he win fair and square? As far as we can tell, did he win through some kind of like sketchy means, right? But like, if he seemed to have won fair and square, like, what do we want to accomplish from this protest?
Finally, sort of amid all the doom and gloom, are the things you're optimistic about?
Oh, I'm optimistic about science. Like, this is like the golden age of studying what works and what doesn't. Like, in the activist realm, but also in the medical realm and in the realm of public policy. Like, we are so far from the age where we, would get sick and like just slap a leech on ourselves and like, maybe get better or maybe die, right? And just kind of like cross our fingers. And thank God, like, we have evidence to test our vaccines, to test our policies, and yes, to test our social movement strategies. So I am so optimistic about science. Of course, I don't forgive its, like, abuses, right? I'm not Pollyannish about it. And individual scientists are extremely fallible, like myself included, right? But science as an enterprise is self-correcting and constantly improving. And scientists at their best are willing to admit when they are wrong. And especially during like the Twitter wars that can drive us nuts, I take solace in scientific evidence to help us resolve debates. Because if you can point to evidence about what is right and what is wrong, you can do more than just yell louder or even worse, like resort to violence, right? So I'm really optimistic about science. It's just a matter of like communicating that science, right? Because like not all of us are, professional nerds like me. And also like scientists need to learn from non-scientists as well to figure out like what kinds of questions should they be asking? How can they do science that's like ethical and like engaged with community and builds on like the rich experiential knowledge of people like activists. And so I think like I'm optimistic about the scientific project, but I am, I guess, more nervously optimistic about the ability to build those bridges between scientists and the communities the science might serve.
It's a bit of a tangent, but I haven't read it yet, but apparently Alan Alda has a really good book about how to communicate science.
Noted. I'll add that to my list right now.
Because apparently he's very passionate about the communication of science and sort of scientific lessons.
I love it. Thank you for the recommendation.
No worries. Lisa, thank you very much.
Truly my pleasure.
I just want to thank Lisa again for taking the time to talk to me today. Please like, rate, and comment on this episode on whichever platform you're listening on. Please. If you want to buy Changemaker and support independent stores in the UK, check out the Strategy Hour and Bookshop page in the show notes. Hope you all tune in again next week.